Zoom is available, found at the bottom of your Zoom video screen. The SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice of the University of San Francisco acknowledges our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pays our respects to these traditional caretakers and elders, past, present, and emerging. It is our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however infinitesimal, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. Welcome everyone to the first event of the USF SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice for the 21-22 academic year, where tonight we will learn with renowned artist Shimon Atti. My name is Aaron Hahn Tapper, and it's my honor and privilege to direct this cutting edge program. Let me begin by thanking a number of people for their support for making this event possible. Thank you to all SWIG JSSJ faculty and staff, especially our Assistant Director, Oren Kroll-Zeldin, our Rabbi in Residence, Camille Angel, the first in our school's 166-year history. Thank you to Paula Birnbaum and Javi Placencia from the USF Museum Studies MA program, who are co-sponsoring tonight's event. Thank you to our amazing program assistant, Victoria Farlow, and our student research assistant, Zoe Bishop. I'd like to take a brief moment to tell you about our USF Museum Studies MA program, as well as our SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Our Museum Studies MA program is a unique and highly individualized in-person 16-month master's program. Courses in museum studies focus on social justice and curatorial practice, education and new technologies, conservation and heritage preservation, law and museum management. Students integrate and apply knowledge from a variety of disciplines in order to analyze global issues that concern today's museums. Everything from equality and diversity within the museum sphere to human rights, repatriation of collections, and decolonization of museum practices. The program prepares its graduates for positions of leadership in artistic, cultural, and heritage organizations operating within our constantly evolving social landscape. Students also enjoy the rich experiences available to them in San Francisco, one of the world's most vibrant, cosmopolitan, and beautiful cities. To learn more about the program and to apply, please visit the link which we will drop into the chat momentarily. As for our SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, founded in 1977, our program is the first Jewish Studies chair or program at a Catholic university in the world. In 2008, we were reestablished as the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, the first academic program worldwide to formally link these two fields. Including a minor in this field, in the classroom, the program offers a wide range of significant Jewish Studies courses not found in other educational settings. Beyond the classroom, we offer extraordinary events that are free and open to the public, such as tonight's event. Let me tell you briefly about our three other events this semester. On Tuesday, October 5th at 6:30 via Zoom, we will learn with Rachel Gross in a program titled Feeling Jewish, Nostalgia and American Jewish Religion. Drawing from her acclaimed new book, Beyond the Synagogue, Professor Gross will speak about American Jewish longing for the past as expressed through artisanal delis, picture books, historic synagogues, and Jewish genealogy, illuminating how many American Jews are finding and making meaning within American Judaism today. Then on Sunday, October 24th, also at 6:30 on Zoom, we will learn with Marcella White Campbell, who will deliver the 7th annual SWIG JSSJ program Human Rights Lecture, followed by a conversation between her and USF Rabbi in Residence, Camille Angel. Titled Racial Justice in 21st Century America, Jews, People of Color, and Multiculturalism, White Campbell will speak about the imperative for racial justice in 21st century America, in the Jewish communities and beyond, from her vantage point as the new executive director of Bechol Lashon, a not-for-profit educational organization strengthening Jewish identity by raising awareness about the ethnic, racial, and cultural diversity of Jewish communities and experiences. Finally, The last JSSJ event of the semester will be held Tuesday, November 16th at 5:30, titled "The Visual is Political: Citizen Videography and Documentary Cinema in Israel-Palestine." This event attempts to address the following. How is oppression represented on screen in Israel-Palestine? What can we learn from both cinema and everyday videos filmed on cell phones and camcorders about how power structures the visual field in the Middle East, how the visual in turn impacts the political, and how resistance is embedded in people's self-representation of their lives? This talk brings together Professors Shirley Bahar of Columbia University and Liat Verdugo of USF, two scholars and artists who study the moving image in Israel and Palestine, both of whom have recently published groundbreaking scholarly books. If you'd like to learn more about these events or the JSSJ program in general, please visit the link, which we will also drop into the chat momentarily. Through the SWIG JSSJ program, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic change. Whether one has the time to take a semester-long course or a mere few hours to hear from a single speaker, education is fundamental to making our world better. Paramount in shining the spotlight on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or another social identity altogether. Now, let me pass the proverbial baton to our Rabbi in Residence, Rabbi Camille Angel, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
I am delighted that we have Shimon Atti with us this evening to talk about his brilliant work, so relevant and compelling to us as a university, a place where we study and pursue justice and celebrate all of humanity. Tonight is Sukkot, the festival whose essence is going outside and making oneself vulnerable to what the outside world has in store for us. This is our annual JSSJ Open Doors Sukkot program. While we are not outside on Welch Field, where historically we have gathered in our huge white sukkah tent, open on all sides, welcoming the tired and the poor, college students, the hungry and the lonely, again, I'm referring to college students, and symbolizing for us loudly and proudly, well beyond the campus, Hinenu, here we are. All are welcome. All can come and seek sanctuary here. Sukkot reminds us that we are all dwellers in a temporary hut. Tonight, we are disturbingly reminded that for some, the conditions are harder than for others. Temporary and uncertain conditions mean something altogether different for transgender people of colors, gays and lesbians living in countries where gay bashing and murder are done in the state's name because it's against the law to be queer. Right now, millions upon millions of women and children and people of all genders are being forced to flee their homes under threat of persecution, conflict, and violence. A small number of these people find their way to the Bay Area, building new lives in our community and contributing to our region's cultural richness and diversity. Activist Avi Rose writes, "We Jews know about refugees. We are no strangers to being strangers. It is embedded in our history, our texts, and our psyches. With long experience and deep empathy, we reach out to the current generation of refugees, grateful at this historical moment to be the welcomers rather than the displaced." So many of us can attest to this from our own experiences, that resettling refugees takes time and it doesn't always go smoothly. Some of us know this from hearing our own family stories. I wonder what Shimon Atti's work will mean for you. As students, you will be sure to let us know in your critical reflection of the evening. Now, without further verbosity, let me introduce our guest. Shimon Atti is a visual artist whose practice includes creating permanent and temporary site-specific installations in public places, immersive mixed media installations for museums and galleries, art photographs, and new media works. In many of his projects, Adi has used a variety of media to animate sites with images of their lost histories or speculative futures. This has included introducing the histories and narratives of marginalized and or forgotten communities into the physical landscape of the present. In other words, in other, often video works, Adi engages local communities in finding new ways of representing, apologies. This has included introducing the histories and narratives of marginalized and or forgotten communities into the physical landscape of the present. In other, often video works, Ati engages local communities in finding new ways of representing their history, memory, and potential futures. Whether working with public sites or in museums and galleries, Adi's work explores how contemporary media may be used to reimagine new relationships between space, time, place, and identity. Shimon Ati's work has been exhibited and collected by numerous museums around the world, including by New York's Museum of Modern Art, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the National Gallery in Washington, DC, the ICA in Boston, and the Miami Art Museum, among many others. In addition, he has received numerous visual artist fellowships and awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Rome Prize, artist grants from the Pollock Krasner Foundation, and a visual artist fellowship from Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute, and from the National Endowment for the Arts, among many others. 5 monographs have been published on Adi's work, which has also been the subject of a number of films that have aired on PBS, BBC, and ARD. Since receiving his MFA degree in 1981, he has realized approximately 30 major projects in 10 countries around the world. In 2013 and again in 2019, Ati was awarded the Lee Krasner Achievement Award, and in 2018 was inducted as a national academician into the National Academy of Design. Finally, in 2020, Shimon Ati was appointed as the inaugural chair, Charles C. Bergman Endowed Visiting Professor of Studio Art at Stony Brook University, and has the Horger Artist in Residence at Lehigh University. Your parents would be so proud. And I can say that because I knew your mom, and I'm kvelling to have known you and be able to bring you to my new home, University of San Francisco. Welcome, welcome, Shimon.
Thank you. Thank you, Camille. We're just pausing for a moment to make a transition. Sorry. Okay. Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction, Camille. I'd also like to remind you that my older sister, Rochelle, is an alum of USF, right? Which is kind of interesting. And thank you very much for the Open Doors Sukkot program of the JSSJ program for inviting me and having me share Sukkot with you. I think of Sukkot also as in relation to welcoming the outsider, the newcomer, the person less fortunate than us into our home, and the offering of safe harbor. And that in some ways informed which projects I'm sharing with you today. I got my MFA in 1991, and as Camille Angel said, I have probably realized about 30 projects since then. I'm only going to share 5 or 6 with you tonight. So without further ado, let us begin. Okay, great. So my first project after art school was the writing on the wall, which I realized in one of Berlin's former Jewish quarters. In particular, it was in East Berlin. And what you're looking at is a color photograph that I made of a building in East Berlin with a slide projection on the building's facade of a Hebrew bookstore that was located exactly at that location in 1930. So it's not collage, it's not a montage, it's not Photoshop. Literally, if you're walking down the street, you see the projection on the building and you turn the other way and across the street, I'm waving at you and I have my generator, my 4 slide projectors and my camera equipment. So this Hebrew bookstore was located exactly at this location in 1930. So if you see these color photographs in a museum or a gallery, you say this is photography. If you see the installation on site, meaning the projection on the building, you say, oh, this is installation art, or this is a public project, or this is site-specific installation. Slide projection of police raid on former Jewish residents. This is from 1920, the historical photograph. This was the neighborhood of Russian and Polish Jewish immigrants to Berlin. It was not German Jews. They were more in the western part of the city. But this was like a police raid on immigrants from Russia and Poland. Slide projection of former Jewish resident. You know, in the Q&A, if any of you are curious, you can ask me what some of the reactions were of residents who lived in these buildings upon seeing these kind of ghostly black and white projections from the past interacting with their homes, present day homes. A slide projection of former Jewish residents. I use the address also in the titles. They're very deadpan, like Muhlachstrasse 37, slide projection of former Jewish residents. And on the left here, you see Berlin Alexanderplatz. You see that was like the surveillance tower and television tower of the East German government, the DDR, in East Germany. And then this graffiti, was der Krieg verschonte, überlebt den Sozialismus nicht, which is the rest of the sentence on the right half of the building, which is another piece of mine, included in another piece of mine, means what the war spared did not survive socialism. So basically, we have many layers of German history here. We have the history before the war, the Jewish residents. We have the history post-war, the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, the socialist government during the Cold War years. And then after the wall came down, we have anti-DDR graffiti that was put up. What the war spared did not survive socialism. Slide projection of former religious book salesmen. Now, I originally, in art school, I come from photography, so I do put a lot of intention into the photographs I make of my installations, and I do typically intend for them to live on their own long after the installations are over. Slide projection of former Jewish-owned hat shop with residents. And the photographer in me is choreographing and composing a series of relationships between the projection, the neighborhood, the architecture, that the human eye would not necessarily do in the same way on site. This is slide projection of former Jewish cafe with patrons. That light flare is not from my projectors. It's I saw it. It's from a street light. I noticed it. I liked it. I let it be there. Slide projection of former Jewish residents. They typically lasted 1 or 2 evenings, and then I would go to the next location. I failed to mention that before I did the first projection, I did about 3 months of research trying to determine where these photographs were taken. And it was no easy task because the East German government renamed and renumbered all of the streets after the Second World War. So I had to get the old city maps from 1925. It was a lot, it was detective work. slide projection of Jewish residents. And of course, historical photographs don't look like this. I'm only using a small portion of them. This was with 3 projections where Berlin's, the former silent movie house was located, Biograph Theater. So the writing on the wall was, you know, in a sense, it was guerrilla art. It was my first project after art school. I had, you know, 4-use slide projectors, and they were those old-fashioned Kodak carousel slide projectors, a used generator, and a 1964 Ford Granada. And I was ready to roll. So after that project, I started getting commissions and invitations to do larger produced projects where I had a budget, I had a year or 2 lead time, I had technicians and crews, and the press was notified in advance. I'm just going to share 1 or 2 of those with you tonight. Again, thinking about Sukkot, thinking about refugees, also thinking about what prefigured, in some ways, the more recent Night Watch, which was on view in San Francisco Bay just until just a couple days ago. One of my early projects with refugees was Portraits of Exile. It was an underwater installation in one of the main canals of Copenhagen. This is 1995. And the project, it wove together 2 human rights tales. One was is a historical one. The other was more contemporary. The historical one was that epic, larger-than-life rescue of 10,000 Danish Jews to Sweden by Danish fishermen just before they were to have been deported to Nazi death camps. Over 10 evenings, they were shuttled to Sweden, which was neutral in the war. So the Jews were safe there. 95% of the community was saved. So it was this kind of larger than life, kind of, you know, mind-boggling, heroic action and expression of altruism. That was the historical tale. The present day tale was one of present day refugees. And when I say present day, I mean mid-90s when I did this project. The situation is much more difficult today in Scandinavia with refugees, especially in Denmark and Sweden. These are portraits of refugees who were living in Denmark in the mid-1990s. There's a background image that gives a little bit of context that Danes tend to recognize right away, but typically others not. So one tale was heroic, the other was very ambivalent, a very ambivalent helping hand to present day refugees. For me, the bridge between these 2 was water. Water as a medium for escape, for rescue, for safe passage, for safe arrival, and obviously also for human memory. That was a woman from the former Yugoslavia with a Danish entry stamp on her passport. This is an image of one of the Danish Jews rescued to Sweden in 1943. So there were 9 very large light boxes. They were lined up right in front of the Danish Parliament building. And it was underwater, I think, for about 6 weeks. It ended up becoming, it was the official project of the city of Copenhagen to commemorate the 50-year anniversary since the end of the German occupation. So already in the 90s, I was working with issues related to refugees and water. That's a Danish Jew rescued to Sweden with one of the fishing boats used in the rescue, just scrubbing right along. Here's how they would appear in the daytime. And then in a moment, you'll see all 9 boxes lined up at the edge of the canal. There you go. And each box was like something like 7 feet by 7 feet by 3 feet. This is pre-LED technology. They weighed about 1,000 pounds each. It was a marine engineering horror show, but it had a good ending, thankfully. Let us move on. Another project I did related to American immigration was this was my first big project in the United States. I lived in Germany for most of the 90s, and then I came back to the United States in the late 90s. I'm going to let this play itself.
Shimon Atti is preparing to make his mark on Manhattan. Over the last 4 months, he's talked to residents about their memories of the neighborhood, as well as their own stories, superstitions, and dreams. He spent more than 2 years planning a laser art installation that will take place here in the heart of the Lower East Side, an area influenced by generations of Jewish, Hispanic, and Chinese immigrants.
I very much respond to spaces and to places, and by temperament, I'm very interested in memory. And how do we give visual form to something so, on one hand, so intangible and ethereal, but on the other hand, something very real for us.
Shimon found his answer with lasers. Words made of light scroll across the architecture in real time, moving from building to building. Fragments of thoughts, poems, songs are all made visible on the street, some in English, others in Yiddish, Mandarin, or Spanish, the languages of this community. It's a major art project that required a lot of coordination and backing.
We couldn't imagine a better marriage for public art.
That was
really
my producer.
Stunning the public with
That's
great
Ann Pasternak,
visuals
who is
and
now
providing
the
them with
director of the
content
Brooklyn
that was
Museum
incredibly
of
thoughtful and
Art.
appealing.
Shimon says that the lasers help animate his project.
The quality of laser light mirrors how memory itself functions. Lasers, they're very intense light, very focused, so they appear to have a presence. And yet, after all, it's just a light source. It's much more like a ghostly kind of writing, as if a ghost is writing out of thin air. That's the visual effect that I wanted.
This is high-tech public art at its most public. Anybody, it seems, who walks through this neighborhood and sees this art installation ends up staying.
Some of the things, you know, are very touching, like someone saying that they live so poorly in a tenement, you know, and the conditions were so bad. And I know that these people come. This population has grown up in this area and have come from bad times.
And this is really a wonderful change, the fact that you could display something in art in a very simple form and in a very easy form, I think, and people could see it in a very clear and in a very beautiful manner. I think it's wonderful.
I think it's going to cause a lot of the people that live in the community to just look differently at the buildings that they live in.
For 2 centuries, this part of Manhattan has been home to many different groups of immigrants, but that's changing as affluent young professionals move in. But Shimon Atti hopes his laser art will help keep the older memories alive. Damien Fowler, BBC News, New York.
The reason I shared that project with you is because it's very specifically American in terms of how a number of different immigrant groups can vie for the same communal space, the same urban spaces, different narratives coexisting together, which is different than let's say, a European context. While that video, that piece from the BBC was good at showing the laser animation write-out technique that we developed, it's a little less good in showing how dramatic the project was visually. As you see here, it basically covered 2 city blocks in Manhattan. I remember when we lived in a tenement in the top floor in very bad condition. It was like a dream, ... After the whole sentence would write out, it would sustain, and that's when I would take this photograph, and then it would unwrite itself. Like, this was the English translation from a Chinese poem. Gosh, you know, there was a time when I had I knew all of these by heart. Changing clothes as one would. I'm leaving now. So changing clothes as one would. Changing places as one would change clothes. I'm leaving now, but I remember my past as closely as tightly sewn stitches. Most of the writings were projected both in English and then in the native language that they were written in. Untitled Memory, I was thinking also about the other frame that I was given for this talk was in terms of queer studies and whatnot. And this isn't exactly directly related to that, but partially. I don't often share this project, but it's a project I did in San Francisco in the late 90s after Between Dreams and History, which I just shared with you. It's my former home in San Francisco. And what was called like a DeVos Triangle. And I photographed old friends, lovers, family members. I projected photographs I had taken years earlier of family members, loved ones, etc., back to where I had made the original photographs, and I added some artificial light. I was sort of reanimating or animating my former home with some of the memories that I had experienced and lived there. I had that apartment for many, many years before I moved to Berlin, and this is post-Berlin. So I sublet the apartment all those years I was in Berlin, and I came back to it briefly for a few months and did this project. That's the well-known San Francisco photographer, Catherine Wagner, and her wife, Loretta. And this is, needless to say, this was during the AIDS crisis. And sometimes this work is contextualized within that frame, even if I wasn't consciously thinking so much about that, but it makes sense. Now, coming much more where we're going to pole vault over about 20 years. That's the fun part of doing presentations and curating a talk. So this is a more recent project called The Crossing that I created with 7 Syrian refugees who had recently crossed the Mediterranean, on rafts to arrive in Europe. My father's family comes from Syria, which was a little helpful at the very beginning in terms of breaking the ice. I created this project in Europe. There's no digital effects and they have no performance experience whatsoever. We trained them. And the invitation came from to do a project. They didn't tell me what to do. They just said, hey, would you like to come and do a project here? We will produce it for you. And it was one of those European microstates that has a history with the casino industry, like where James Bond films were made, etc. It was also a country in 2000, it was completed in 17, but I think we filmed it in 16, where the Syrian refugee crisis was very present in that country. So I had this idea. I wondered if there was something about the game of casino roulette that in some ways spoke to the refugee experience in terms of the forces of life and death that are completely outside of one's control. These 7 individuals were fortunate. They made it. They did not drown. They were not disappeared by the Syrian government before they had a chance to flee, but many obviously are not so lucky. And I asked them what they thought of this idea, if roulette was a good metaphor or distillation of their life experience. If they said no, I wouldn't have done the project. They said, Shimon, this has been our entire life. This is exactly right. Let's do it. So we did it. So it's a 7 or 8 minute video, art video. I'm not showing it to you all now. I'm not showing the entire piece to you now. It might get loud just for 1 second, but it cycles through 7 tableaus. With each passing tableau, there's 1 person less. We don't see them leave the table. We don't know if they won or if they lost. They're just gone. I think we still have all 7. We still have all 7 participants. And they're young, they're beautiful. Bible and here. And again, for the Q&A, you might want to blank expressions, because that's a big part of my thinking when I work with traumatized communities, including with the individuals who were featured in Night Watch. So let me just scrub through. Now we're down to 4 people. Now here's 3, I believe. So as you can see, my work crosses over between photography, installation art, and the moving image. And there's some performative elements, obviously, in my work as well. projects. And the tension builds gradually in the piece. The soundtrack is mostly abstracted sounds of wind and water, human heartbeat, and then like the ambient sounds of a roulette tabletop, like the fingernails going across the mat. I think I'll just let it play to the end now. There's 2 people left from the 7. And the process of engaging with potential participants in a project such as this, as with many other pieces that I've done, can take several months, just that piece of it. For the millions of individuals fleeing the wars in Syria and elsewhere, individuals who have gambled their futures by making the dangerous journey to Europe in hopes of finding new lives. 7 of these individuals appear in this piece. I often have dedications at the end. And then I sometimes, depending on where I show that piece, if there's enough space and if there are resources, I will sometimes present it as an immersive installation where elements of the film bleed into the space so that one is in the piece rather than looking at it. But that requires video projectors on the ceiling. So getting a little more recent, Night Watch was originally mounted in New York City a couple of years ago in the waterways around Manhattan, primarily the East River and the Hudson River, and it was mounted during UN General Assembly Week. And it was, you know what, I think I'm just gonna let it speak for itself. Hopefully, just try to read the first 2 pages. Because I tried last night to read it, and I can't read it fast enough. Most of the individuals are from the international LGBTQI community or were unaccompanied minors when they arrived at the border. I'm not remembering now if there were 11 or 12 individuals. It will tell me at the end. But again, each of them have harrowing stories of near death, of being pulled from their apartments, attacked by mobs, fleeing for their lives, and now they are new Americans, and they live amongst us. They're not thousands of miles away. They are our neighbors, our employers, our friends. And in New York, the barge circulated for 8 consecutive evenings. And again, it was during UN General Assembly Week when world leaders were in New York. And of course, the photographer, the cinematographer in me, obviously was very aware of these juxtapositions, like the Statue of Liberty with the individuals displayed on the screen, and the way that the content of that would resonate. She was a judge in Russia. There she is. She had she had discovered a corruption scheme among government officials, and they told her if she didn't flee the country, they would kill her and her daughter. Now, here's a little excerpt from the film itself that's displayed on the barge, the 9-minute film, silent video portraits. It opens with that James Baldwin quote, "We contain the other hopelessly and forever." And I'm just going to show you the first two people out of the 12, just so you can get a sense of the aesthetic quality of the portraits. This is a gay Jewish man from the former Soviet Union, who is an artist, lives in New York. And they approach the camera emotionally restrained by design. I don't want to hand over the emotional goods. The viewers often think, we often think we know what those who have been less fortunate than us feel, and we don't always know. Sometimes we're wrong. And they are entitled to be opaque and to their own interiority. So I try to honor that. And when I explain that to them during the filming, they go, right on. That's exactly right. People always project stuff onto us. This was an unaccompanied minor at the border. She's from Honduras, meaning she was apprehended at the border and her parents were not there. And then this 9.5-minute film, these 12 silent video portraits, it ends again with a dedication for the millions who've been forced to flee their homelands to escape violence and discrimination. For the fortunate few who've been granted political asylum in the United States. 12 of these individuals appear in this piece. About 9 of the 12 were from the LGBTQI community, and the other 3 were the unaccompanied minors. Let me go on. Oh, wow, in case you weren't there, you missed it this weekend. Newsflash from San Francisco. This is from Friday night, Port Mason, at least it's starting here in Port Mason, Golden Gate Bridge. Night Watch just came to San Francisco Bay due to the Herculean efforts of Catherine Clark and Boxblur, almost single-handedly brought it to the Bay Area, which I'm still in disbelief how she managed to pull this off. There's Alcatraz. It's a very, very complex project to mount with many moving parts. Requires significant financial resources as well. But the Bay Area was so embracing of this project that within 6 months, she did it. With 40 partnering organizations all around the Bay Area, from museums, artist organizations, refugee advocacy organizations, etc. And then excuse me, no. I often do try to, if I feel that a situation is sufficiently photographic, in quotation marks, I do try to photograph my installations to create still images that can live on their own after the installation is over. These are some stills I made from Night Watch in New York, the Brooklyn Bridge. Oh, I see this is not great, sorry. This can move over, it can't move. Okay, doesn't matter. And I think the last thing I'm sharing with you, just a little snippet of, is a brand new piece I made, which is also debuting and premiering. I should mention that I have a concurrent with Night Watch is a solo exhibition of my work at Catherine Clark Gallery. They opened on the same weekend. And Catherine is mounting the first major survey show of my work on the West Coast. My work is more known, I would say it's fair to say, on the East Coast of the US. So I would encourage all of you to go visit the exhibition. It's up until October 30th. There are two brand new pieces that are premiering there. One of them is The View from Below, which is based on, it's a sort of it derives from Night Watch. It's about a 3-minute video. I'm not going to show all of it to you. Of the reflections, the upside down reflections of the asylees. Now, I should have said earlier, maybe a little more clearly, these are not just immigrants. These are people whose asylum applications were approved by the US government, which means their lives were saved. So it was matters of life and death. I wanted the project to have that kind of poignancy to it. And this was during the time of Trump that I made the work. And that gives you that's just sort of a little bit of a teaser. And what do we have here? Nope. And I think I already announced the show. I'm premiering another piece there, a large video installation I created called Time Lapse Dance, which I made in Brazil, which collides Brazilian dance and capoeira martial arts with, let's say, nativist political tendencies that cross international boundaries with Mel Brooks. Crazy project, but it's super fun, and it's premiering at the gallery. But as it does not directly relate to refugees per se, I decided not to include it in today's presentation. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. We're going to take a couple of minutes to transition to Q&A, so don't go anywhere. I'm going to turn the camera off and mute it. 1 minute. I mean the Zoom camera.
Close up. I'm going to pass the baton to Dr. Bargabay, who will be leading our Q&A with Shimon. Dr. Bargabay teaches in our SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. She received her PhD from the Department of Comparative Literature at UCLA. Her research explores dynamics of secularism, tradition, and state in Hebrew literary narratives of Mizrahi authors. She teaches courses on refugees and ethics, and on Jewish identity, and on the graphic novel. Dr. Bargabay will ask the first couple of questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So please put your questions into the Q&A. Thank you.
Your work. It's a really fascinating oeuvre. And it got me thinking about the similarities between a sukkah and an installation, or sort of thinking about a sukkah as almost like an anciently inspired installation because it interacts with the elements. It's, has to be open mostly on the top. And I think in some ways that prompts our thinking about temporariness, lack of shelter, the vulnerability of movement and mobility. I wonder about the role of projection in your work in terms of conveying that same ephemerality that the sukkah conveys. And it seems to me that if I may put it in very grand terms, that projection almost subverts time and space in the sense that it is, that it overcomes physical boundaries and also any kind of linear history, like it's palimpsestic in trying to convey a layered history to us. And I wonder if it also conveys the vulnerability of the subjects and the places that are attached to those subjects. And if you could just talk a little bit more about projection in your work and its importance.
Right. Well, I should probably start by saying that at this point in time, probably a minority of my projects still use projection in public places. But but in my early years as an artist, I certainly did a lot of pieces that relied on projection, and it is a topic that I obviously thought a lot about. And it's interesting to hear your own formulations for it, which I think are right on the mark. In terms of myself, I think about projection as having the ultimate duality between materiality and ethereality, and it being ethereal at the same time. You project an image, it looks like it has substance. It's there, you see it, but what is it actually? It's photons. It's barely has any material substrate whatsoever. Why is that significant? Because for me, it's significant because it mirrors my sense of human memory. That memory and history also have a kind of a duality where they can seem substantial, but where is their material substrate or basis? I mean, I've read different theories about how memories work in the brain, and the fluid flows this way. You roll over in bed, it flows that way. There's different theories about it, but that for me, it was primarily both the material and ethereal, the dual nature of projected imagery that felt like it was just the right medium, given the content that I was interested in engaging.
Mm-hmm. And just that it's actually comprised of light, but it tricks us maybe into thinking that there's something substantial.
Yes.
Because in the moment there actually is.
Right.
And that memory works much the same way.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's the record that we have of the past. It isn't the past, but it's all that we have in a certain way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And also another kind of Sukkot association, I think, is just the elements, right? I think Sukkot is about being in the elements, whatever they may be. And I think particularly for Night Watch, I mean, Night Watch is so much about the element of water, right? And it takes place in the water. And you know, water is such a source, is such a threat to refugees. I think it's something like 6 refugees a day die in water crossings. I don't know. I mean, that's not like maybe the most recent statistic, but it is very frequent. And of course, we all remember the image of Elan Kurdi washed up on the shore. And also there was a young man and his daughter in Matamoros who were coming from El Salvador. Oscar Martinez Ramirez and his daughter Valeria, who's 2 years old. I think we all also remember that image. And it seems to me that the way that water works in Night Watch is maybe in some sense a reminder of the precarity of sea crossings, but also, as you said, as a bridge, right? That we are encountering these faces in the water. It seems like such an important part of the installation. And in the video, there's the sound of the water that actually in some ways is more calming. And I wonder if you thought about maybe those dynamics of both danger and bridging when it comes to water.
Absolutely. It encompasses all of that, and of course also a lot more, you know, such as, for example, the history of the Bay Area and of New York City in terms of their role in American immigration for the last 200 years. And a lot, not all of it, but a fair amount was water crossings. And so it relates also directly to sort of social, political history of the United States. But indeed, water is very frail. It's a very fragile medium, both obviously aesthetically because it's constantly fleeting and moving. It's not static, and as you said, it's also it can be a tomb. I'm thinking of an article I read by Jill Cassid. You know Jill?
No.
About the net, what is it called? The necro.
Necropolitics.
Yeah, yes, necropolitics related to the Mediterranean. But anyway, no, but it's very interesting. While we're on the topic, I just wanted to mention that seeing the piece Night Watch at Fort Mason. Were you there? Did you see it?
I unfortunately couldn't
Yeah,
make
okay.
it.
It was so radically different than how it was in whether the Hudson River or the East River of New York, which is a much more urban situation. And there's buildings in the background, whether it's looking onto Brooklyn or looking onto New Jersey. And here it was just open sea. And then you saw some kind of relatively uninhabited parts of Marin County in the distance. And it had a whole different, it resonated in an entirely different way. There was much more stillness, and the hundreds of people that were there to see it, there was just this hush in the crowd. It was very singular. It was very singular. But again, to your point, water, and again, this is not my first project working with water, but obviously I'm drawn to it, especially related to the subject matter. And it includes both the promise, the safety, the hope, the offer of safe escape and a new life on the other end. But it also offers danger and risk and possible death. So.
And perhaps also a sense of connection, right? Maybe an asymmetric connection, but we are all connected through water. And that's maybe how we experience, hopefully, our responsibility to the other in some way through that bridge.
Yes.
And you also mentioned the importance of blank faces with regard to the roulette. And so I am curious about that. And also just in Night Watch, the importance of the face. It makes me think of the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas and the idea of the face-to-face relation.
Yeah, exactly. I was reading that. Yes, exactly. In the case of Night, I wanted there to be this sort of emotionally uninflected, meaning restrained, I thou encounter. I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. And an encounter where the viewer is not given many hints about which way to take it, because the person is not showing that much emotion. Their interior life is not written on their face. So we're kind of left to grapple, and maybe we even have more questions after the experience than before. That's one reason why I tend to film individuals who have had a traumatic life experience with a restrained face, but there's many other reasons as well. For example, for The Crossing, the film that I made with the 7 Syrian refugees, it wasn't just that their faces were blank, but their movements, right, were very automaton-like. They were very robotic. And I did that because no one ever leaves their homeland when they have no other choice. They never do that with joy or happiness. We go into an automatic pilot. We do what's necessary to survive. In that sense, we become, in a sense, partially robotic, automaton-like, just to survive. So I was trying to kind of reflect that experience. And then again, the whole thing about, hey, I think I know what a refugee is like or feels. They're either, I feel sorry for them, or I have sympathy, or I find them abject, or I'm repulsed, or I exoticize them. I mean, whatever it would be. And I wanted to just sort of short circuit all of that and not confirm any of those projections. And so, basically to turn it upside down, so the viewer's expectations were not met or confirmed whatsoever.
Right, because there might be some sense among those of us who have the blessing of being settled in a Western country, that
Mhm.
we're almost entitled to those stories in some
Right,
way.
right.
And that they're story, to us, they're a story, but to your subjects, they're life. So it's a way of maybe preserving that inherent asymmetry.
Yes, yeah, yeah. There's also sort of the opposite, which is, I mean, you're not asking me about it, so I should probably keep my mouth
Oh,
closed.
no, please.
But there's also the sort of the opposite phenomena, right, where we, the whole thing like, well, we're all refugees.
Right.
We all have inner refugees, and I'm sorry, but this is, I have some issues with that,
Absolutely.
I don't, yeah, that's being a refugee of privilege, refugee as metaphor, right?
Yeah,
As
right.
opposed to like fleeing for your life.
Right, refugee
Right.
as someone's lived experience that we can't fully access, that we need to respect
Right,
that.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And I think also, as much as there is also an asymmetry, there's
Mhm.
also a reciprocity, right? In the sense that that's what the gaze does, that we're looking at them and we're looking at, of course, an LED screen
Mhm.
video of them, but they're looking at us
Yeah,
too.
that's
We're being
exactly,
examined.
that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
That's exactly the point. It's not just us about them being sort of the object of our gaze, we're the object of their gaze, and they are looking at us and seeing how we respond to them, how we do we come forward with humanity and compassion, or are we rejecting and angry?
Right, and it's our test, and how will we perform?
Yeah.
And we're put on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we do, okay. Oh, right here,
Oh.
okay, audience questions. So, should I say who they're from? Okay, this is a question from Eleanor Almagor. And Eleanor, or is it Eleanor? Eleanor wants to know, do you include audio and storytelling in your work, or prefer visual representations and the unsaid?
It's an excellent question. I mostly prefer the latter, but audio can be helpful in terms of supporting, sort of being like an underbelly or a bed that can support the visuals. But I don't typically include like verbal storytelling. I'm not a documentarian, and I am trying to work with primarily visual means to see if it's possible to create a piece that invites viewers to experience familiar subject matter in new ways. So it's not about transmitting information, because we have a lot of that already. It's about, hopefully, if we're lucky and if our work is successful, hopefully creating a piece that might offer a chance to experience a new experience.
Defamiliarizing in some way.
In a way, although that I personally wouldn't say that, only because that sort of implies alienation or denaturalizing in a way. But I know.
Recontextual.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And we have a question from Clark Suprinowitz from Immersive Arts.
Hi, Clark. Mm-hmm.
And Clark asks, you talked about this already, but I think there's hopefully more to say. How did your San Francisco experience of Night Watch differ from your NYC experience?
Yeah, well, I already attested to some of the aesthetic pieces. The poetics of the project is very different in San Francisco Bay than it is in the East River or Hudson River around Manhattan. Here it's less urban. I mean, we all know Northern California is like gorgeous, right? I'm from here. But anyway, but the other thing which I actually spoke about yesterday elsewhere is that, New York is this huge metropole. So you can do a project, you can even get a feature in the New York Times, and it lasts like a New York minute. It's like life in the fast lane. It's like a blip on the radar. Here in the Bay Area, Clark from Immersive Arts Alliance, together with Catherine Clark from Boxblur, they, in a very short period of time, they cultivated relationships with 40 different local organizations. And the whole Bay Area was activated by Night Watch. You know, the film is on the Berkeley Art Museum, BAMPA, the screen. It's also on view in Minnesota Street Project for some weeks. It was projected onto the towers of the San Francisco Art Institute. And there's also a lot of by-programming with refugee organizations and whatnot. So it felt, it did feel like a, you know, I don't want to, I have to be a little careful because I don't want to say this one's better, that one's less good, but it did feel like the whole Bay Area was in on it.
We're better is what you're saying.
Well, there was definitely more community involvement, I will say that, across the board.
Okay. We'll take it.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And we have a question from Lily Basting. And Lily would like to know, why are refugees a consistent theme in your work? Can you say more about why this theme is important?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that. I do have a, you know, we're all wired differently. And also the way, and the part of how we're wired is the values that one grows up with at home. And I grew up in a very progressive Jewish family where to be Jewish meant to try to help those who are less fortunate. They were synonymous. And so there's always been well, I have a compassion or a concern about people who are, where life has not dealt them such a fortunate hand as it has us, all of us in this room here. So, you know, basic humanity, kind of common humanity, basic humanistic values about helping each other. And if I was to go back to a Jewish frame, of course, Tikkun Olam, healing the world, making a better world with one's life. So more specific than that, it's really hard for me to say. You know, it's kind of like, well, why do you care what you care about? It is it is one of the big topics that I care about. And I guess it just has to, it could have been me, for example, right? But it wasn't. So that's probably the best I can do right now.
And it's maybe something that's so at the heart of your concerns that it's hard for you to even maybe step outside of it and think about it, because it's just such a part of what you do.
Right. I should also say that when I was approached by More Art, that's the organization in New York that initially commissioned Night Watch. This was during the time of Trump. And I did have a few months to consider what I wanted to do. And in response to the zeitgeist of what was going on, this subject matter felt even more urgent to me. So I was also partly responding to the zeitgeist.
The times, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it is a wonder, a miracle, I don't know what to call it, that many of your subjects in Night Watch received asylum under Trump.
Yes, but not because of, rather in spite of.
No, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right,
but that is all.
But that's true. That is true. That is true.
We have a question from the wonderful Elias Raymer. Elias, nice to see you out there. The UN has estimated that by 2050, there will be 1 billion climate refugees. Your work is such a powerful teaching. How do you address this?
The issue of climate change? I have not. I mean, it's probably implicit, right? If we're working with water.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably implicit, but I have not. I have many artist colleagues who do. But I have not so far. Not for any reason, just that you can't do everything, right? So.
Yeah. And then we have a question from Jasper Magruder. Why did you choose to specifically elevate LGBTQIA+ refugee voices?
That's a very good question. It was that community and also unaccompanied minors at the border, and primarily because, I mean, these are sort of tricky things, you know, because it's, you know, it's not like a hierarchy of priorities. It rather was a combination of two main things. One is that those are two of the most vulnerable groups fleeing violence in their homelands. And the second is also rather practical and logistical. The organizations dealing with those two communities in New York were very forthcoming in terms of being involved with Night Watch. So, that's the sort of the practical piece of it.
Yeah, and I think also in the case of LGBTQIA+ refugees, they encounter persecution both in countries of origin and in the countries where they
Yes.
arrive, which is of
Yes.
course not unique to them as a refugee population.
Right,
Refugees of color encounter this as well, but
Right.
there's also that precarity.
Right. But I do want to say something on this point, which I sort of had crossed my mind during my presentation, which is again, this is sort of, the flavor of the month term, right? But it really comes to bear, which is intersectionality. So most of the people in Night Watch, most of them are queer, not all though. Probably half of them are people of color, half of them are women of color and queer. I mean, it's just this hybridity of identity, which is so much of what so many of us are, which is just, that's the world we're living in, myself included. So I think therefore that compartmentalizing, it can only take us so far, is that this group and not that group, but wait a minute, what about I'm in this group and I'm in that group, right? So
Yeah, we have our foot in many places,
Right.
and that can be a source of bridging and richness.
Right.
And
right.
yeah. And since we are on the subject of your subjects, I know you mentioned it here, and I've heard you say it in other places, that it takes you many months to get to know them.
Yes.
And could you talk about that process and also the ethics of that process?
Oh yeah, oh God, the ethics are a big piece of it. Oh my God. Usually it's 3 to 6 months of my life will be spent from beginning to end just engaging local communities. I sometimes, when I'm fortunate, I have help. I'll have a producing organization that helps me. And we typically, you don't just go to people on the street. You typically have to go through certain channels, and such as an organization that advocates for asylees, just for example. And we first approach them. We get a meeting with the key people in that organization. I share my past work with them. I tell them what my idea is for the new project, what I hope it will do, what I hope it will achieve. And then hopefully they get very interested and excited, and then they introduce me to their clients. And then we do have meetings. Typically, it might be a group of 3 or 4 people at a time, sometimes one person, sometimes 10 people. But the ethics, though, this is a great question, because I have worked with this for so many years. I did a very intense piece with a Welsh village that had lost all of its children in an avalanche that buried the village's only school. And here I was working with a community of people who had lost their children. Can you imagine? And who had been harassed by the worldwide news media ever since, because it became this epic, like a site of disaster tourism, the village that lost its children. Aberfan is the name.
Yeah, there was a Crown episode about that.
Yes, there was a Crown episode, exactly. So, but in any case, with that project, that's when I really began to think very deeply about ethics, right? And these people have been traumatized not just by the catastrophe and losing their children, but also the voyeurism, the curiosity. So I have certain rules that I follow. If I'm working with a community that's been traumatized, I never ever ask them about the trauma. If they want to speak about it, they can come forward. but I never asked because that almost always is coming from my own voyeurism. My curiosity, it's about me. They often will, on their own, want to speak about things, and that's fine, but that has a very different quality. The other thing is I make certain commitments. You know, if I say to a community, I will show you in a way you've never been seen before, I will do my best to do that. Or I won't use any archival footage of the disaster that you experienced, et cetera, et cetera. I become very small with very big ears when I work with individuals who've been traumatized. I say very little, I tread very lightly, and I get my antennae just get really big. I'm there to listen and not to lead, in a sense. So those are some of the things that I do in terms of ethics. You know, it's not so simple though, right? I mean, I wish we could just leave it at that, but that wouldn't be the truth, right? It's sometimes you're in a situation where you have to choose between being a good artist and being, you know, if you don't intervene artistically, sometimes you're going to have a very mediocre artwork. And if you have a mediocre artwork, why bother? It's not going to be effective in terms of bringing people along or the public along to experience something, you know, radically new. So sometimes it's, you know, it can be a kind of a tough call. Fortunately, those times are rare. But, you know, one of the, and I'm just going to say it, one of the, I would say curses, but one of the misfortunes of community-based art is, you know, when it becomes ideological and it becomes a canon, where people are very determined to check every single box on the community engagement side and less determined to check every single box on the artistic power side. Well, gee, you feel like you've been a good social worker, but the piece is not that as strong as it could be. So that's something I struggle with sometimes, and sometimes I've come to fisticuffs sometimes, as the Brits say. So
of the priorities, the art versus ethics. And
yeah, I mean, usually they can align, but not 100%. Not 100%.
Can you think of an example? I don't want to.
No, I don't want to get, well, just only because my mind is not in a
sure,
specific, I'm
sure.
not thinking so specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I did also want to ask, and I hope the students of THRS 39005 are paying close attention, because we just watched Human Flow by Ai Weiwei. And he also shows himself a lot with his subjects. I don't know a lot about his process, so this will just be our last question.
Sure.
Do you know anything about his process or the film, and do you have thoughts about how he relates to his subjects?
Well, it's very, it's a subject I would rather avoid but I'm not going to avoid it because you're asking me a question, I'm going to answer you. But because I had strong feelings about the film. And one of my pet peeves in life is when something comes really, really close to being like amazingly fantastic, but then it has a fatal flaw, right? And then I get very frustrated because it could have been so great, except. So my problem with Human Flow, it's a beautiful film. I mean, like the cinematography is amazing. It's a radical enterprise in so many different ways. I think the film would have been so much better if he had removed all the scenes of himself. I found them to be extremely problematic, self-referential, self-conscious, and really not necessary. So those really, for me, they kind of broke the experience.
Well, it seems like the opposite of what you were saying about the importance of making oneself small with large antennae.
Right. Let me just put myself right in the middle of it, you know, with the haircut. And the whole thing, no. I mean, I just found that to be very problematic, but I might be a small minority of people. in that regard. Otherwise, I thought it was a great film. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for presenting your work with us in this Open Doors program. And it was really wonderful to hear about Night Watch and just to be reminded of the importance of opening to the other, the stranger, the refugee in ways that are ethical, thoughtful, unintrusive. And it was great to be in conversation with you.
Same, likewise. Thank you everyone for having me.
Shimon, thank you so much for being our guest. Time and again, you bring the unseen into sight and you provide us the opportunity to bear witness. How will we respond? Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you at our next event on October 5th with Professor Rachel Gross, and look forward to your reflections on the evening. Chag Sameach, happy Sukkot.